I was an archivist. Third class. I documented tithes, recorded grain yields, catalogued the endless administrative minutiae that kept the Imperium grinding forward across 10,000 worlds. When the corruption came to Golan's Reach, I was assigned to document its progression for the Sector Administratum. When the shadow in the warp descended 6 weeks later, I continued documenting. That was my duty. That is how I came to witness what happens when two vast, inhuman hungers collide over the same feeding ground. And I alone, Emperor, forgive me, I alone may understand what it means. The corruption had been gradual, almost bureaucratic in its spread. It began in the Underhive, they said, though by the time the Administratum acknowledged the problem, entire hab blocks in the mid-levels had already fallen to the grandfather's embrace. I remember the smell changing first. Golan's Reach had always carried the standard hive reek, recycled air thick with industrial particulates, human sweat compressed across millions of bodies, the acrid bite of manufactorum runoff. But the corruption introduced something else, something organic and wrong. A sweetness, like fruit left to rot in summer heat, undercut by the ammoniac tang of suppuration. The air grew thick with it. We breathed it. We tasted it on our tongues. My superior, Lexicanum Hadris Vaughan, assigned me to maintain observational logs from our administratum spire in the upper hive. Document everything, he said, his augmetic eye clicking as it focused on my face. Symptom progression, infrastructure degradation, population losses, doctrinal compliance rates. The sector governor will require comprehensive data for the inevitable exterminatus order. He spoke of planetary annihilation with the same flat effect he used to discuss grain quotas. I suppose we were trained that way, trained to observe human suffering as data points, to translate agony into numbers that could be filed and forgotten. I documented faithfully. Day 7 post-corruption acknowledgement, 43% of lower hive unreachable. Day 12, reports of physical mutation among the afflicted. Day 17, organized cult activity detected in zones 4-4 through 8-9. The corruption was Nurgle's work that became clear quickly enough. The physical signs were unmistakable. Flesh bloating with internal growths, skin taking on a greenish pallor, weeping sores that never healed but somehow never killed. The afflicted walked through the streets in increasing numbers, some laughing, some weeping pus, all radiating that sickly sweet stench of decay. But what disturbed me most, what I struggled to quantify in my reports, was how times content times many of them seemed. I watched from my spire windows as crowds gathered in the plazas below, singing hymns to the Plague Father in voices thick with phlegm. They embraced. They touched their wounds together, sharing infections like gifts. There was a community in their corruption, a terrible warmth that the Imperium's cold machinery had never provided. I documented this too, though I suspected Hadris would redact those observations before transmission. 3 weeks into the corruption's spread, the sky changed. I was at my desk, updating casualty estimates, when the Vox network died mid-transmission. Then the lights flickered. Then every piece of equipment in the administratum complex stuttered and failed in sequence, as if an invisible hand had swept across our systems and switched them off. I looked out my window toward the stars and saw nothing. The perpetual haze of Golan's Reach normally glowed with reflected light from the system's binary suns. Now there was only darkness, thick and absolute, pressing against the Armorcry's panes like something physical. The astropaths began screaming shortly after. I heard them through the walls of their shielded chamber, 3 levels below my office. They screamed for 4 hours before falling silent. The shadow in the warp, we learned later, though learned, suggests understanding, and we understood nothing. We only knew that something vast was coming, something that had cast its psychic shadow ahead of itself, like a predator's silhouette falling across prey. The Tyranids made planetfall 2 days later. I documented the first sightings. Massive organic shapes descending through the cloud cover on wings of chitin and membrane, spore pods erupting across the Underhive and no man's land between the corrupted zones and the Imperium's last defensive perimeters. The smell changed again. The sickly sweet rot smell of the corruption remained, But now it competed with something else, an acrid, chemical stench like burning metal mixed with organic decay, sharp and astringent where the Nurgle taint had been cloying and thick. Here is what I began to wonder. Here is the question that consumed my thoughts as I watched the two apocalypses converge. What happens when the Tyranids consume corrupted biomass? Would the Great Devourer itself become tainted by chaos? Would the Hive Mind fracture under the Plague Father's influence? Or would something worse occur, some synthesis of ravenous hunger and divine decay? I resolved to document everything. If I was to die on this world, and I accepted that I was, then at least my observations might prove useful to the Imperium's xenobiologists. At least my death would have meaning in data recorded, patterns noted, conclusions drawn. It was the only consolation available to a third-class archivist facing oblivion. The initial contact between the Tyranid swarm and the Nurgle cultists occurred in Hab Sector 12, a mid-hive zone that had fallen to corruption 8 days prior. I watched through a pictor feed as Hormagaunts, those swift-hunting beasts of the Hive Fleet, poured into streets thick with plague victims. The cultists didn't run, they stood there, some raising arms in welcome, others simply waiting with that eerie patience the Grandfather's followers always displayed. They seemed to expect the Tyranids to recognize them as fellow servants of entropy, as allies in the work of breaking down the Emperor's realm. The Hormagaunts tore them apart with mechanical efficiency. Scything talons separated limbs from torsos. The feeding began immediately. And this is what I needed to see. Would the Tyranids feeding on chaos-corrupted flesh show signs of taint? Would their chitin take on the greenish pallor? Would sores erupt along their carapaces? Nothing happened. They consumed the biomass, absorbed it into their systems through specialized feeding tendrils, and continued hunting. No mutation, no visible corruption. The corrupted flesh was simply fuel, converted and consumed like any other organic matter. I documented this obsessively. Tyranid organism exhibits no apparent vulnerability to chaos corruption through ingestion. Biomass absorption proceeds normally, regardless of source material's prior exposure to warp-based pathogens. But I needed more data. I needed to observe sustained contact to see what happened over time. The Hormagaunts were simple organisms, barely more than ambulatory mouths. What about larger creatures? What about those that seemed to possess some rudimentary intelligence? I found my answer at the Cathedral of the Weeping Legion. I had been tracking this location for weeks, watching as the Nurgle cultists transformed a once sacred shrine to the Emperor into something obscene. They had piled corpses in the nave, each body swollen and bursting with disease. They had painted the walls with pus and bile, creating murals that writhed with bacterial life. A greater daemon had manifested there 3 days before the Tyranids arrived. I had documented its emergence, the way reality tore like diseased flesh to birth something that should not exist in physical space. The daemon was still present when the Tyranids reached the cathedral. I watched through my long-range pictor as Tyranid warriors, those horrific synapse creatures that coordinated the swarm's actions, approached the building. They moved with purpose, not the frenzied rush of the lesser organisms, but a calculated, intelligent advance. The daemon emerged to meet them, a massive thing of rotting flesh and exposed entrails, laughing with voices that sounded like bursting pustules. The Tyranid warriors opened fire with their bioweapons. Living ammunition struck the daemon's physical form, boring into its corrupt substance. The demon laughed harder, reaching out with talons the size of plasteel girders. It touched one of the warriors, and I saw Emperor preserve me. I saw the creature's chitin begin to rot, saw pustules erupting along its carapace. But then something changed. The Tyranid warrior didn't recoil. It didn't flee. Instead, it seemed to absorb the corruption. And then, and I documented this, I have the recordings. If anyone ever finds this account, it expelled it. Through specialized pores along its carapace, the Tyranid purged the daemonic infection as a kind of acidic mist. The surrounding air shimmered. The mist fell on the cobblestones and ate through them like industrial solvent. The other warriors converged on the daemon. They didn't fight it in the way Imperial forces would, trading blows and seeking to banish it back to the warp. Instead, they seemed to dismantle it, methodically removing pieces of its physical manifestation while their bioweapons pumped it full of toxins and digestive enzymes. The demon's laughter turned to shrieks. Within 17 minutes I timed it, the daemon had been reduced to inert matter, its connection to the warp severed through some means I could not fathom. The Tyranids consumed what remained, showing no ill effects. I updated my documentation. Tyranid warriors demonstrate active resistance to chaos corruption. Observed ability to purge daemonic influence through biological processes. Successful deconstruction and consumption of greater daemon of Nurgle with no apparent contamination of consuming organisms. This should have reassured me. The Imperium's great enemy, chaos, could not suborn the Tyranid swarm. The aliens were immune to corruption. But I felt no reassurance. Instead, a creeping horror began to take root in my thoughts. What I was witnessing was not simply one monster devouring another. It was something far more disturbing. The Tyranids were cleansing the corruption, not as the Emperor's servants would, through sacred flame and prayers of purification, but through perfect, mechanical consumption. They were eating the chaos taint, breaking it down into base components, rendering it into nothing but proteins and minerals to fuel their endless hunger. Where the demon had stood, where hundreds of cultists had worshipped in diseased ecstasy, there was now only bare rock, scoured clean of every biological molecule. The smell in that sector changed dramatically over the following days. The sickly sweet corruption stench faded, replaced entirely by the acrid chemical reek of Tyranid bioforms. It was as if the very air was being cleansed, filtered through alien systems, and expelled, purified of taint. I began to track this phenomenon across the hive. Wherever the Tyranids advanced, the corruption retreated, not overcome by superior force, but simply unmade, consumed, rendered into fuel. But I had my own concerns beyond documentation. The corruption had touched me. Not severely, I had not fallen to the grandfather's embrace, had not begun the transformation that claimed so many, but I had breathed the tainted air for weeks. I had touched surfaces in the administratum spire that others had touched, others who had shown symptoms, and one morning I woke to find a small lesion on my left forearm, weeping a clear fluid that smelled faintly sweet. I did not report it. What would be the point? The Medicae staff had fled or died weeks ago. Hadris would simply have me executed as a contamination risk. Instead, I documented it in my personal logs. Day 34 post-corruption acknowledgement. Minor lesion detected on primary subject's left forearm. Approximately 7 millimeters in diameter. Painless. Producing serous fluid. Subject maintaining cognitive function and continuing documentation duties. The lesion did not worsen, but it did not heal. It remained there, a small window into my body's betrayal, weeping its clear corruption while I went about my work. I found myself touching it compulsively, feeling the slickness under my fingers, checking to see if it had spread. It never did. It simply persisted, a constant reminder that I too had been tainted, that whatever separated me from the shambling cultists in the streets below was a matter of degree, not kind. Meanwhile, the war continued. The Tyranids advanced through the hive in a pattern I struggled to understand at first. They did not simply swarm toward the highest concentrations of biomass, as xenobiologist reports suggested they should. Instead, they seemed to prioritize the corrupted zones, moving methodically through each Nurgle-infested sector before advancing to clean Imperial territory. It was as if they were deliberately cleansing the taint before consuming the uncontaminated biomass. I documented this pattern obsessively. I created maps showing Tyranid advance vectors overlaid with corruption spread data. The correlation was undeniable. Everywhere chaos had touched, the Tyranids went first. And everywhere they went, they left nothing, no biomass, no structures, no trace that anything had ever existed there, except bare stone and metal frameworks too inorganic to be worth consuming. By week 5, I had to abandon the Administratum Spire. The Tyranids had reached the mid-hive levels and were advancing steadily upward. Hadris had departed 2 weeks earlier, evacuating aboard one of the last void-capable shuttles to escape the planet before the Hive Fleet's orbital organisms made spaceflight impossible. He took most of the staff. He left me, and a dozen others like me, with orders to continue documentation until the end. I relocated to a bunker in the industrial sector, a hardened facility that had once stored Promethium reserves. It was empty now, the fuel long since consumed by the Hive's desperate attempts to maintain power to the remaining districts. But it had thick walls, independent air circulation, and most importantly, a still-functioning Voxcaster with enough range to transmit my reports to the orbital relay stations. Whether anyone was still monitoring those stations, I had no way of knowing. From the bunker, I continued my observations using remote picture feeds scattered throughout the Hive. Many had failed, but enough remained operational to give me a comprehensive view of the war's progression, and what I saw in those final weeks broke something in my understanding of the universe we inhabited. The Tyranids were not simply consuming the chaos corruption, they were studying it. I watched through Pictor Feed 47 as a massive Tyranid creature, something I later identified from xenobiological records as a Hive tyrant, stood before a corrupted shrine, one of dozens that dotted the Hive where Nurgle's followers had erected monuments to their patron. The Hive tyrant did not immediately destroy it. Instead, it circled the shrine, its massive cranium tilting as if in examination. Smaller organisms, I think they were lictors. Those terrifying stalking creatures approached the shrine and seemed to sample it, extending specialized appendages to touch the corrupted surfaces. Then, after nearly an hour of this behavior, the Hive tyrant opened fire. Its bioweapons reduced the shrine to molecular slurry in seconds. But that hour of study, of examination, haunted me. What was it learning? What intelligence guided the Hive Mind's approach to this corrupted biomass? I found evidence in sector after sector. The Tyranids were not mindless devourers. They were careful, methodical, almost surgical in their approach to the chaos corruption. They isolated corrupted zones, established perimeters with warrior organisms, then sent in specialized creatures to analyze before consuming. It suggested a level of planning, of strategic thought, that the Imperium's xenologists had never attributed to the Tyranid swarm. My own condition deteriorated during this time. The lesion on my arm had not spread, but I had developed others, small ones, scattered across my torso and legs. They wept that same clear fluid, and the smell around me grew steadily sweeter despite my best efforts at hygiene. I was becoming corrupted, slowly but inexorably. Yet my mind remained clear. I could still think, still reason, still document. The grandfather's touch had not claimed my soul, only my flesh. And then I noticed something else. Something that should have been impossible. I had been exposed to Tyranid spores. The bunker's air filtration was good but not perfect, and the atmosphere outside had grown thick with the microscopic reproductive matter the aliens released wherever they went. I should have been poisoned, should have developed the rapid cancers and toxic reactions that Imperial medical texts described. But I hadn't. The spores had entered my lungs. I could feel them there, a faint tickling sensation when I breathed deeply, but they caused no damage. I began to suspect that the chaos corruption in my system was interacting with the Tyranid spores. Neither could gain full purchase because the other was present. I was caught between two vast biological systems, each seeking to remake me in its image, each preventing the other from completing the transformation. I documented this in my personal logs, noting every symptom, every change, every strange sensation. If nothing else, my body's reaction to dual contamination might prove scientifically valuable. By week 7, the hive had been largely consumed. Where millions had once lived, now only bare streets remained, scoured clean of organic matter. The Tyranids had moved through the corrupted zones with terrifying efficiency, rendering daemons and cultists alike into base components. The corruption was gone. The sickly sweet smell had faded almost entirely. replaced by the sharp chemical reek of the Hive Fleet's presence. But in a few isolated pockets, something strange had occurred. I discovered this through Pictofeed 93, which monitored an underhive sector that had been heavily corrupted early in the outbreak. The Tyranids had reached it, had begun their consumption, and then stopped. The creatures pulled back, establishing a perimeter but not entering the sector itself. I watched for 3 days as they maintained this cordon, keeping the corrupted zone isolated but making no move to cleanse it. I risked a direct observation. I had to know what was happening. I still had a functioning ground vehicle in the bunker's garage, an old cargo hauler with enough fuel for a short journey. Against all judgment, against every survival instinct, I drove toward that sector. The smell hit me first, even through the vehicle's sealed cabin. It was neither the purely sweet corruption stench nor the purely acrid Tyranid smell, but something else, something that made my sinuses burn and my eyes water. I approached the perimeter cautiously, stopping 200 meters from where I could see Tyranid warriors maintaining their watchful positions. Through the vehicle's viewport, I could see into the corrupted sector. What I witnessed there defied my understanding. The Nurgle corruption remained, festering on walls and pooling in the streets, but growing through it, like fungal growths through rotting wood, were Tyranid organisms, not separate from the corruption but intertwined with it, their chitin taking on a sickly green hue, their forms twisted into shapes that should not have been anatomically possible. They were hybrids. Somehow, in this isolated pocket, the Tyranid biomass and the chaos corruption had merged. The organisms that moved through those streets were neither fully alien nor fully demon-touched, but something caught between, and the Tyranid warriors at the perimeter were not there to consume this zone. They were there to contain it, to prevent whatever had occurred from spreading into the broader swarm. I documented everything with shaking hands. This was beyond my training, beyond my understanding. The question I had asked weeks ago, what happens when Tyranids consume chaos-corrupted biomass, had a more complex answer than I had imagined. Usually, nothing. The Tyranid biology was robust enough to break down and purge the taint. But in rare circumstances, under conditions I could not determine, something else could occur. The two forces could merge, creating something new and terrible. I drove back to the bunker, in a state of shock. My reports had been wrong. Not entirely in the vast majority of cases, the Tyranids did successfully cleanse the corruption. But there were exceptions, there were failures, and the Hive Mind itself recognized this, isolating the contaminated organisms rather than allowing them to spread their taint through the swarm. That night, I examined my own lesions more carefully. They had changed. The clear fluid they wept had taken on a faintly greenish tint, but around each lesion, the skin had hardened, developing a texture almost like chitin. I pressed my fingers against these hardened patches and felt no pain, only a distant pressure, as if the nerves beneath had been replaced by something less sensitive. I understood then what was happening to me. The chaos corruption and the Tyranid spores were not simply coexisting in my body. They were competing, fighting a microscopic war within my flesh. And as they fought, they were both changing me, transforming me into something that was neither corrupted cultist nor Tyranid bioform but something caught between. I should have been terrified. Perhaps I was, beneath the clinical detachment that years of archival work had instilled. But mostly, I felt a strange curiosity. What would I become? Would my transformation complete before the Tyranids consumed the planet entirely? Would I retain enough of myself to document my own metamorphosis? The final weeks passed in a blur of observation and transformation. The Tyranids completed their consumption of the hive's uncontaminated zones with ruthless efficiency. Billions of tons of biomass were processed, broken down, absorbed into the Hive Fleet's vast biological machinery. The planet's surface began to show visible signs of depletion, forests withered to skeletal remains, oceans drained to expose bare seabeds, even the atmosphere thinned as the Tyranids extracted every possible resource. But the corrupted pocket remained isolated. I checked on it regularly, watching as the hybrid organisms within grew stronger, more numerous. They were building something, I realized, using both Tyranid biological engineering and some echo of Chaos Corruption's reality warping influence. They were constructing structures that defied physical laws, towers of chitin that twisted through impossible angles, pools of biomatter that bubbled with both digestive enzymes and daemonic energy. The Tyranid warriors at the perimeter grew more numerous. The Hive Mind was taking the threat seriously. I documented long-range observations of massive bioships in orbit, adjusting their positions, focusing on the corrupted sector. They were preparing to destroy it, I realized. The Hive Mind had decided that salvaging the biomass was impossible, that the contamination was too severe. They would sterilize the entire zone from orbit. I made a decision then. It was not a rational decision, but I had moved beyond rationality. My transformation was nearly complete. The lesions covered most of my body now, weeping that greenish fluid, surrounded by patches of hardened, chitin-like skin. My thoughts had begun to fragment, some coming to me in my own internal voice, others in something that felt alien, distributed, as if thinking with 1,000 minds at once. And beneath both was something else, a whisper of laughter, ancient and patient, the grandfather's endless amusement at the cycles of decay and renewal. I drove to the corrupted sector one final time. The Tyranid warriors did not stop me. Perhaps they recognized what I had become, neither threat nor resource, but something irrelevant to their calculations. Or perhaps the Hive Mind was curious, wanted to observe what would happen when an organism like me entered that contaminated zone. I abandoned the vehicle at the perimeter and walked into the sector on foot. The smell overwhelmed me immediately, that combined reek of sweet corruption and acrid alien chemistry, so potent that I could taste it coating my tongue, feel it settling into my lungs with each breath. But it did not sicken me. If anything, it felt familiar, like coming home to a place I had never known I'd left. The hybrid organisms ignored me at first. They moved through the twisted streets with purpose, tending to their impossible structures, engaged in activities I could not begin to understand. But as I walked deeper into the zone, some began to take notice. They approached with movements that combined Tyranid efficiency with a kind of playful corruption, tilting their malformed heads to examine me. One reached out with a limb that was part scything talon, part rotted tentacle. It touched the lesion on my arm, and I felt connection. For just a moment, I understood what I was witnessing. These hybrid organisms were not failures. They were something new. The Hive Mind sought to consume all biomass, to perfect itself through absorption of genetic material from every species it encountered, and chaos sought to corrupt all things, to spread its influence through the material universe. In this isolated pocket, the two imperatives had met and merged. The hybrids were both parts of the Hive Mind and touched by the warp, capable of coordinated action but also individual will, driven by hunger but also by the dark god's desires. They were an impossibility made manifest, and they existed in this liminal space only because the Hive Mind had not yet decided whether to destroy them or attempt to study them further. I sat down in the street, my back against a wall of twisted chitin and corrupted flesh, and I laughed. The sound came out wrong, wet and buzzing, as if my vocal cords had been replaced by something that approximated speech through entirely different mechanisms. I had spent weeks documenting the interaction between Tyranids and Chaos Corruption, trying to understand what happened when two vast forces collided, and now I had become the answer to my own question. The orbital bombardment began 3 hours later. I felt it coming before I saw it. The hybrid organisms around me stirred in agitation, responding to signals I could somehow dimly perceive. The Hive Mind had made its decision. This zone, and everything within it, was to be purged. The first bioplasma strike hit 6 blocks away. The impact shook the ground, and I felt the heat wash over me even at that distance. More strikes followed, walking across the corrupted sector in a pattern designed to ensure nothing survived. The hybrid organisms tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The Tyranid warriors at the perimeter cut down any that approached, while the orbital bombardment consumed those that remained within. I did not try to escape. I sat against that wall and continued documenting, speaking my observations into a Vox recorder that somehow still functioned despite everything. I described the destruction, the heat, the way the hybrid organisms dissolved under the bioplasma's touch. I noted that the chaos corruption itself seemed to resist the bombardment, reality warping in small pockets to deflect or absorb the strikes, but that this resistance was insufficient. The Hive Mind's assault was too methodical, too comprehensive. The final strike fell directly on my position. I felt the heat, saw the wall of bioplasma rushing toward me, and in that last moment I understood the answer to every question I had asked. The Tyranids could consume chaos corruption because they were beyond corruption, not immune through purity like the Emperor's faithful, but immune through perfect, mechanical hunger that recognized no distinction between sacred and profane, clean and tainted. They broke everything down to base components, and at that fundamental level, chaos could not touch them. But when given time, when isolated and allowed to interact with Tyranid biomass over extended periods, the corruption could take root, not in individual organisms, but in the spaces between them, in the synaptic connections that linked the hive mind together. It could introduce individuality where there should be none, desire where there should be only hunger, and that, more than any physical mutation, was what the hive mind feared and could not tolerate. The bioplasma consumed me, breaking down my transformed flesh into atoms and energy. My last thought was a strange one, a hope that my documentation had been transmitted, that someone somewhere would read my observations and understand what I had witnessed, that my death would have meaning in data recorded, patterns noted, conclusions drawn. But even as consciousness faded, I felt something persist. The lesions on my body, the corruption and the spores intertwined, resisted dissolution. They existed in that space between material and immaterial, touched by the warp in ways that physical matter could not be. And as the bioplasma tore through me, I felt those fragments scatter, spreading on the wind that the bombardment created, seeking new purchase in the world beyond. I cannot say what I am now. I am not alive in any conventional sense, but I am not dead either. I persist, somehow, in fragments and echoes. I can feel the hive mind above, the vast consciousness that directs the swarm. I can feel the laughter of the grandfather, amused by this small triumph over oblivion, and I can feel the planet dying beneath me as the Tyranids complete their harvest, consuming the last biomass and preparing to move on to the next world. They will leave Golan's reach as a barren rock, scoured of every trace of life. The chaos corruption will be gone, consumed and purged, but I will remain, a ghost in the machine, a consciousness caught between two vast forces that should never have met. I am the answer to the question I asked. What happens when Tyranids devour a chaos-corrupted world? Sometimes they succeed completely, leaving nothing but clean stone. Sometimes they fail, and contamination spreads where it should not. And sometimes, in rare circumstances, something new is born, something that carries traces of both forces forward, a seed of impossible synthesis that might grow in some future feeding ground. I was an archivist, third class. I documented tithes and grain yields, and in the end, I documented my own transformation into a thing that should not exist, a consciousness preserved in the space between hunger and corruption, forever observing, forever recording, forever unable to die or live in any way that would grant me the Emperor's peace. This is my final report. This is the answer to the question. And somewhere in the void, the Hive Fleet moves on, carrying within its vast biological machinery a contamination it cannot detect, a corruption it cannot purge, a fragment of the grandfather's work that will spread and grow, and perhaps, in some distant century, bloom into something terrible. The documentation is complete. The observations are recorded, and I, whatever I have become, continue in the darkness between stars, waiting for the next world, the next collision, the next impossible synthesis of forces that should remain forever separate. The Emperor protects, they say. But no one protects us from the spaces between, from the cracks in reality where neither his light nor the hive mind's hunger can reach. And in those spaces, we who fell through the cracks continue, aware and suffering, transformed beyond salvation but not beyond consciousness. This is what happens. This is the answer. And I am the proof, echoing across the void, a warning that will never be heard, a document that will never be filed, an observation that continues long after the observer ceased to exist.